This is East Asia Tonight.
Good evening, I'm Ateli Edwards. Tonight's top stories from East Asia. China uses a U.S. court decision to reiterate that it is time to cancel unilateral tariffs after a judge ruled that the White House can't make blanket decisions on levies. Beijing slams Washington's plans to revoke student visas, calling it a political move that tramples on students' rights. It's lodged a formal protest, saying ideology is being used as an excuse. Now, a South Korean Navy patrol plane has crashed in the mountains near Pohang in the country's southeast, killing 4 crew members on board. Meantime, early voting for the next president gets underway in South Korea, with more than 3,000 polling stations open nationwide. Both major candidates have already cast their votes. Also in East Asia tonight, anticipations building up ahead of the annual defense summit, Shangri-La Dialogue, here in Singapore, with senior officials and top political leaders gathering for keynote speeches, bilateral meetings, and more. We'll tell you what to expect. And we'll also be looking at the issues impacting East Asian companies and workers, a result of the ongoing US-led trade war on CNA+. China's foreign ministry has reiterated Beijing's long-held stance, rejecting trade levies imposed by American leader Donald Trump. Well, this comes after a U.S. federal court ruled against the president's sweeping tariffs, preventing them from taking effect.
在关税问题上，中方已经多次阐明了立场：关税战、贸易战没有赢家，搞保护主义损害各方的利益，终究不得人心。
Now, a 3-judge panel at the Court of International Trade made the decision after 2 lawsuits by businesses and state officials argued that Mr. Trump's tariffs are illegal. Well, the court says an emergency law invoked by the White House does not give the president unilateral authority to impose tariffs on nearly every country. Well, the Trump administration has since filed an appeal and said it could take the case all the way to the Supreme Court if needed. The ruling, which applies to separate tariffs applied on goods from around the world, marks one of the biggest setbacks for Mr. Trump amid a flurry of lawsuits over his executive orders. All right, and it's over to Roland now for a look at the markets. Roland?
Thanks, Oteli. For more insights, we are going to be joining, first of all, Gary Ng. He is senior economist at Natixis. He joins us from Hong Kong. Gary, good to have you on the show as always. Now, how are Asian policymakers? I'm very interested, especially the export-oriented economies, Japan, South Korea, China, Vietnam. How are they likely to adjust their trade negotiation strategies in response to the legal setback for Trump's tariffs?
Well, I mean, if we first look at the market performance, and definitely everyone is more optimistic about the short-term prospect because of this lower risk in growth and also inflation. But however, in terms of negotiation, it will basically mean a change in the tactics that countries may have. Because what the U.S. has previously is really this big bargaining chip in tariff, and especially a lot of Asian countries, they do rely very strongly on the U.S. end demand, but at the same time, the China immediate input as well. So I think what we see in the U.S. in terms of the legal challenge basically means that the U.S. may not be able to implement that wide range of tariff after all. So it means that all the governments may actually adopt a more wait-and-see approach to see what the U.S. will actually do. And that basically means that it may actually delay the negotiation process or any potential deal in order to achieve the best outcome.
So, Gary, the risk sentiment in the markets appears to be improving. Which sectors within the Asian equity markets do you think showed the strongest and weakest performance following the U.S. court ruling?
Well, I do think that if you first look on the surface, right, the equity investors are basically quite happy, and then it basically means that those sectors or countries exposed more to the U.S. Demand will actually eventually benefit more, or at least in the short run. So when you look at the tech sector, when you look at countries like Japan, those are really the one that has a relatively big exposure to the U.S. but kind of stuck in a way that that's not really a deal, like the UK, etc. So I mean, these countries or this market are likely to benefit in the short run. However, there's really no certainty about how the whole things will play out because this is really one legal challenge that we are seeing here, and there's no guarantee that it may not actually come back to us to much worse scenario than where we are right now.
Gary, what's your forecast for Asian currencies over the next quarter, given the changing dynamics of this U.S. trade policy?
Well, I think one biggest difference versus where we were last week is really about this lower inflation pressure that the US may have, which basically means that the US interest rate may not be actually as high as it is. So therefore, I think to that sense, it basically means that the risk sentiment towards the US assets or the worries on policy risk may actually dial back slightly in the short run, which may result in a slightly stronger dollar. So therefore, in the short run, it's likely to see some depreciation pressure in the Asian currency because of this renewed strength in the US dollar, and also about this much less pressure that the US may implement or press Asia countries to depreciate or appreciate their currency. So I think this is pretty much what we will see in the short run. However, in the long run, it really depends on whether investors will actually still lose the confidence in the US assets and then basically switch to all the other Asian currencies. This really depends on the upcoming response by the Trump administration.
And Gary, let's talk about the bond markets in Asia. I mean, are they reacting to investor flows, yield expectations? And what sort of signals are central banks giving in response to easing trade tensions?
Well, I do think that the biggest move that we see is really about the lower general interest rate across the board. It's not only the US, it's also about all the other Asian market, simply because investors are actually dialing back the inflation expectation. If there's no tariff, then basically the inflation may not be actually as high as before, and therefore bond yield will not be as high as well. So this is pretty much the scenario that we see right now. And for central banks, this is really good news because one worry that many Asian central banks may have in mind is that if US, the Fed cannot really cut interest rate, if Asian central banks actually cut, then that wider interest rate gap may actually result in some capital outflows eventually. But this time around, because we see this pause in the tariff, I mean, this narrowed yield differential is actually beneficial for central banks in Asia to cut rates further to support growth.
Hey, many thanks for your insights. Gary Ng, senior economist at Natixis, speaking to us from Hong Kong.
And we've got more analysis for you. The ruling has blown a hole in Washington's trade talks underway with more than a dozen nations. That began after levies were imposed. And it also throws into question recent agreements with the UK and China. And analysts we spoke to earlier shed some light on that.
Right now, if these tariff threats are no longer legal in the US, then that urgency in coming to the negotiating table and hammering out an agreement, that urgency doesn't really exist. But there are exceptions for this. You look at markets like Taiwan and South Korea, for example, who are big exporters of electronics, automotives.
But experts remain cautious that the worst is over, as this adds to the uncertainty about U.S. policy making. They say this trade uncertainty is toxic to investment and economic growth and would drive chief executives and policymakers to put off major decisions. The White House has announced it would appeal the court's ruling, which currently has 10 days to halt the tariffs. But if the past months have been indicative of anything, it is that nothing is set in stone. Nick Marrow back with what's to look out for in the coming days ahead.
The main thing to watch right now is what is going to happen the next couple of days, couple of weeks regarding whether the Trump administration, again, will be able to stay this ruling, whether it will be allowed to continue to collect tariff duties as the appeals process continues. But beyond that, I think we need to remember that the U.S.'s trade grievances with markets like China, but also Vietnam, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, they go beyond tariffs. They go into structural imbalances. They go into grievances around the currency.
And it seems that even if the Trump administration concedes on its push for tariffs, there are still other sources of grievances.
The reciprocal tariffs and the sectoral tariffs will have to be removed. Maybe then we'll have to go down through a different approach. You may recall back in 2018, the process was generally a lot slower, that Trump would announce a review. I forget the name of the review. Then after several months, the tariffs were imposed, but they were imposed using a different power to do that. So the same thing could happen again.
And I'll be back with more business news a little later on.
Okay, we'll chat more in a short while. All right, China's foreign ministry said that it firmly opposes American plans to revoke Chinese student visas. It said that the U.S. is using ideology and national security as an excuse and has harmed the legitimate rights of Chinese students.
美方以意识形态和国家安全为借口，无理取消中国留学生签证，严重损害中国留学生的合法权益，干扰两国正常人文交流。中方对此坚决反对，已向美方提出交涉。美方这一政治性、歧视性做法，戳穿了美国一贯标榜的所谓自由开放谎言，只会进一步损害美国的自身国际形象和国家信誉。
The U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio earlier announced that Washington will begin, quote, aggressively revoking visas of Chinese students. The move will specifically target students with connections to the Chinese Communist Party or those studying in critical academic fields. Criteria for future applications, both from mainland China and Hong Kong, will be revised to enhance scrutiny. This is the latest escalation in the Trump administration's push for greater control on foreign students. U.S. embassies worldwide were earlier asked to stop scheduling student visa interviews. The administration last week sought to block Harvard from enrolling foreign students. Just last week, during a House committee hearing, Mr. Rubio said that student visas are a privilege, not a right, and that visas can be stripped from individuals who are, quote, intending to tear the U.S. apart. Well, CNA spoke to Chinese students who have plans to study in the U.S., and most choose to stay watchful about the situation.
毕竟这些政策上的事，其实也不是我们能左右的，我们就是看到政策是什么，然后我们做相应的应对，就是基本上就是这样。
我的话其实暂时不太担心，因为包括和我录同样项目的同学校友，然后他们的态度都比较乐观，然后我的那个帮我做这些流程的那个中介，他也觉得没什么问题。
肯定还是就是有更多的这个考虑因素吧，但是具体的核心具体有什么影响，还是过去了才知道。所以因为现在人在这边，其实不太有直接实感吧。
South Korea's Navy has confirmed the deaths of all 4 crew members on board a patrol plane that crashed on a mountain in the southeastern city of Pohang during training. Well, their identities have yet to be confirmed. No civilian casualties have been reported. Well, this incident took place at around 1:50 p.m. local time near a military base. The crew comprised of 2 officers and 2 non-commissioned officers. Well, this is the first known crash involving a P-3C aircraft deployed by the armed forces. Witnesses reported smoke rising from the crash site. Firefighters were earlier deployed to extinguish the blaze. The Navy has established a task force to investigate the cause and temporarily suspended all flights of the same aircraft model. Separately, a South Korean soldier has reportedly misfired a machine gun that's aimed towards the tense inter-Korean border, prompting a quick response from the military to inform North Korea about the incident. Well, the incident happened in Yangju, about 25 kilometers north of Seoul, around 5 p.m. local time on Wednesday. The soldier is said to have discharged a single round from a K6 heavy machine gun while stationed at the General Outpost Unit. It's the second such case in just a month. South Korea's Joint Chiefs of Staff says a broadcast was immediately sent to Pyongyang to explain the incident. It added no unusual activity was seen from the North Korean military. An investigation is now underway. Coming up next on East Asia tonight, Toyota sales continue to hit records, boosted by last-minute purchases before U.S. auto tariffs come into effect. Plus, South Korea's K-pop labels preparing for the reopening of the Chinese market. Hello again. Good to have your company on East Asia tonight. As promised, it's now time for more business news with Roland Lim. Now, Roland, K-pop gearing up for its China comeback after what seems like more than a decade?
Exciting times, yes. Two of South Korea's top labels have ramped up their China business teams over the past few months as Beijing looks set to lift a de facto ban on performances in the country. More on that in a while, but first, Toyota sales have hit a record for the second month in a row, boosted by demand in the US and Japan, driven by a rush of last-minute orders before US auto tariffs came into effect. April global sales for the automaker, that's including its Daihatsu and Hero subsidiaries as well as its Lexus marquee, were up more than 12% on year at almost 937,000 units, and production close behind, up 12%. At more than 902,000 units. Meanwhile, the Japanese automakers' sales grew in key Asian markets, China and India, both up around 20%, while sales slumped in Southeast Asia, led by the Philippines and Thailand, and Indonesia also down by more than 5%. Toyota's EV sales also showing strong growth, up more than 40% in North America on year, and in China, also up nearly 40% despite stiff competition from rivals such as BYD. Shares of Toyota closing up nearly 4% on those strong numbers. Markets in Asia remain focused on Japanese assets as the nation's debt drew its weakest demand in nearly a year. The Nikkei 225 closing out today 1.9% higher, and the Japanese yen weaker slightly by 0.3%. It's weakening towards that $145 level after the lackluster performance of sovereign bonds at yesterday's auction. Investor appetite for Japan's longest-dated bonds were sluggish, with a bid-to-cover ratio hitting its lowest since July of last year. Now, other longer-term Japanese notes still in sell-off mode. Markets keeping a close watch on potential spillovers to other high-debt economies. And South Korea's central bank has delivered another rate cut in a bid to shield the export-driven economy from the impact of deepening risks stemming from US President Trump's tariffs. The Bank of Korea has lowered its policy rate by 25 basis points to 2.5% in a widely expected move. Now, it's the fourth rate cut since the central bank began its easing cycle in October. A growth contraction last quarter and softening inflation in South Korea also supporting the case to ease monetary policy. The Bank of Korea joins other central banks in the region in easing policy settings to give their economies enough buffer against tariff risks. The BOK has also lowered its growth forecast to 0.8% this year. Remember, in February, it also revised down its growth forecast to 1.5%. The BOK's rate decision also comes ahead of South Korea's presidential election next week. Both leading candidates have pledged to roll out extra fiscal spending to lift the economy if elected. South Korean shares jumped to their highest level in nearly 10 months as investors welcomed the central bank's decision to trim interest rates and a U.S. court move to block President Trump's proposed tariffs. South Korea's record-high trade surpluses are expected to narrow with continued investment into the U.S. market. That's according to the nation's biggest exporter group. South Korea's surplus with the U.S. last year rose 25% on year, hitting a record high of $55.6 billion, led by car exports. the Korea International Trade Association says that much of the increase in trade surpluses with the U.S. was from substitution of Chinese products in U.S. supply chains, as well as changes in demand patterns there. But the group pointed out that about 47% of the surplus was made up of intermediate goods shipped over for direct investments. And checking shares of AI bellwether Asian suppliers, chip makers and chip adjacent stocks among the top gainers today. South Korea's SK Hynix, which supplies NVIDIA with memory chips, well, that's up 1.9% for the day. And Foxconn, which assembles NVIDIA's chipsets, it's up 2.6%. And in Japan, its chip testing equipment maker Advantest, that is up 5.4% for the day. And Japan's top chip maker, Tokyo Electron, up 4.25% for the day. Asian chip makers tracked NVIDIA's gains overnight, and the world's most valuable chip maker has wrapped up the latest earnings season with an optimistic forecast for the current quarter. NVIDIA gave an upbeat revenue guidance for the current period, even as a slowdown in China weighed on its first quarter results. Now, it echoes guidance from the rest of the big tech cohorts that kept their outlooks mostly intact despite of the tariff uncertainty. For the first quarter, it reported better than expected profit and revenue as the company's booming data center that's recorded an on-year growth of more than 70%. This positive report comes despite geopolitical headwinds, including recent export restrictions on its China-bound H20 chips. The growth numbers would be enviable for most chip makers, but for NVIDIA, it was the smallest percentage gain in 2 years. Still, the chip maker has regained much of the ground lost in a steep sell-off earlier this year, triggered by the sudden success of China's DeepSeek. NVIDIA's CEO Jensen Huang used much of his company's earnings call to challenge the U.S. president to ease controls on chip exports to China. And just in the past few hours, the Trump administration reportedly cut off some American companies from selling software used to design semiconductors to China. Now, we asked Albion Financial Group's Jason Ware earlier on whether he thinks there could be cause to start capping exposure to U.S. firms with outsized China revenues.
It depends on who you are. If you're a trader, probably. If you're a long-term investor, no. Because again, we have to look at the total pie here, the total addressable market for AI, for semiconductors, for software, for agentic AI, for cloud infrastructure. You look across the stack of AI here from the infrastructure layer all the way up to the software and application layer. The reality is that the total addressable market globally, China is a piece of that, to be sure. Jensen Huang was talking about that today on the call about how big China can be. But there are other elements, other growth elements to the story, and we're still very much in the early innings. So I think near term, it's going to be a bit of a hiccup, but longer term, there's just so much growth ahead that I don't think it's going to matter much if you have a 3 to 5 year view. Investors need to take the long view on China and just the general build out of AI infrastructure. We're still seeing really solid demand in NVIDIA's results, because when you back out the impact of the H20 export restrictions to China, it's actually a beat and a raise. What I mean by that is they're coming in less than $1 billion light in terms of relative outlook in Q2, and yet they're talking about $8 billion hit from the China export restrictions. Wall Street was thinking it was going to be more like 4 to 5. So when you back that out, underlying demand is actually plus 3 billion. So what that tells us is that things are tracking really well in terms of Blackwell. Demand for their GPUs in terms of AI infrastructure looks really good. And so you got to own this name for the long term. China will sort itself out over time.
BTS's label Hybe has opened its first office in China as expectations rise over Beijing's plan to lift its decade-long unofficial ban on K-pop performances. Now, it's not just Hybe. Rival SM Entertainment has also unveiled a strategic partnership with Tencent to launch a Chinese idol group and deepen cooperation on music businesses in China. Now, Tencent Music is also buying a nearly 10% stake in SM Entertainment. Lifting the ban potentially opens South Korean companies to resume music distribution through the relationship with Tencent. Amid signs of easing restrictions, South Korean boy band EPEX announced that it'll perform this weekend at a concert in Fuzhou, the first all-Korean cast performance in China in 9 years. And that news sparked a rally in Korean entertainment stocks, with Hype up 40%, and SM Entertainment nearly double, and YG Entertainment up more than 85% this year alone. Beijing imposed an unofficial ban on K-pop back in 2017 in response to South Korea's deployment of the THAAD missile system. Before the restrictions, China was one of the largest markets for K-pop. And that'll do it for Business News. Oteli.
Thanks so very much, Roland. Well, we're going to go for a short break now, but coming up next on East Asia tonight, Asian leaders calling for greater cooperation in an uncertain and turbulent world. CNA's Michio Ishida with a report from the Nikkei Forum held in Tokyo. And U.S. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth set to lay out the Trump administration's Indo-Pacific plan at a premier defense summit here in Singapore this weekend. This is East Asia Tonight, and here are the headlines we're following. China reacting to a U.S. court ruling against implementing Donald Trump's sweeping tariffs reiterates its long-held stance of rejecting trade levies imposed by the American leader. The U.S. says it will revoke Chinese students' visas for individuals they deem to pose a threat, such as those studying in critical fields or having links to the Communist Party, prompting rebuke from China. And a South Korean Navy patrol plane crashes in a mountainous area in the country's east, killing all of its 4 crew members. Early voting in South Korea's presidential election began today at more than 3,000 polling stations nationwide. A Democratic Party candidate, Lee Jae-myung, and People Power Party candidate, Kim Un-soo, both cast their votes ahead of the June 3rd poll.
반드시 투표에 참여하셔서 이 잘못된 결과를 빚어낸 내란 세력에 대해서 엄중하게 강력하게 심판해 주시기를 바랍니다.
만약 안 해버리면 전체 투표율이 낮아지기 때문에 상당히 문제가 있고 우리가 불리해지기 때문에 일단은 제가 먼저 투표를 한 겁니다.
A turnout rate by 6 p.m. local time stood at 19.6%, or about 8.7 million people. According to the latest Gallup poll, Mr. Lee leads with 49%. Mr. Kim follows behind with nearly 37%. And New Reform Party's Lee Jun-suk trails with 10%. 2 independents are also in the running. The snap election was triggered by the ousting of former President Yoon Song-yeol over a failed martial law bid in December. The winning candidate will have to deal with the country's economic downturn, trade talks with the U.S., and concerns over the high cost of living.
지금 시국이 작년 12월 3일부터 해서 안 좋아졌잖아요, 많이. 그래갖고 그거에 대해서 좀 심판을 한다는 의미로 해서 투표를 하게 됐습니다.
지난 또 몇 개월 동안 좀 다 같이 국민이 힘든 시간을 보냈었는데 이제 뭐 정치적으로나 경제적으로나 좀 더 안정되는 마음으로 그러한 나라를 위해서 일할 수 있는 대통령을 뽑기 위해서 사전 투표를 하러 왔습니다.
Asian leaders are calling for greater cooperation at the Nikkei Forum in Tokyo as trade tensions and conflicts in Ukraine, Gaza, and South Asia cast uncertainty in a turbulent world. The Japanese Prime Minister Shigeru Ishiba was among those gathered at the forum. CNA's Michio Ishida with this report.
Prime Minister Shigeru Ishiba said Japan will be the knight for free trade. He spoke at the 30th annual Nikkei Forum in Tokyo, where he said that as the only G7 country representing Asia, Japan aims to be a bridge to the U.S. and Europe. Mr. Ishiba added that he is keen to expand the CPTPP Free Trade Pact. Japan is also in talks with the U.S. over President Donald Trump's plans to impose reciprocal tariffs. Tokyo wants these removed, especially for its key exports, cars and steel.
高い関税を張ることによって経済が反映することはございません。共に投資をする、日本国が合衆国に投資をすることによって、日本とアメリカが共同して 素晴らしい製品を作り、世界の人々にそれを提供する。
Other leaders who spoke included Singapore's Deputy Prime Minister Gan Kim-yong, who stressed the need for Asia to forge new alliances and deepen regional integration, as well as the chief advisor of Bangladesh's interim government, Muhammad Yunus. The Nobel Peace Laureate, who took over after former Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina was ousted last year, noted growing tensions and global uncertainties. Mr. Yunus said he hopes to revive cooperation within South Asia and is also waiting for permission to join regional bloc ASEAN. Professor Yunus also has his own challenges back home. He said his immediate task is domestic reform, citing plans to hold elections sometime between the end of this year and June next year.
If you go back, use the same rules, same procedures, same institutions, the institutions which created forces which will kill people, we said we don't want that institution. We turn it around.
On the second day of the forum on Friday, leaders, including Cambodia's Prime Minister and the President of Laos, are expected to share the challenges they face in a turbulent world. Michio Ishida, CNA, Tokyo.
A U.S. Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth, will be looking to reassure allies in the Indo-Pacific of the Trump administration's commitment to the region when he represents the U.S. at the Shangri-La dialogue. Well, global partners have been rattled by the turbulence and uncertainty created by Donald Trump's return to the White House. Nick Harper in Washington has this report.
Before departing Washington, the U.S. Secretary of Defense made it clear he has a message for Indo-Pacific partners, amid Washington's growing concerns about Chinese military buildup.
Under this administration, we will achieve peace and deterrence through strength. And that's by working by, with, and through allies and partners, specifically in the Indo-Pacific. So that's why it's been a focus of ours from the beginning. It will continue to be. We're going out to Singapore to hold a series of meetings to ensure that region understands America will be strong.
The annual meeting has become the main forum for defence ministers to huddle on the world's most pressing issues. Secretary Hegseth's speech on Saturday, outlining the Trump administration's approach to the region, will be closely watched. Eli Ratner was the former Assistant Secretary of Defense for Indo-Pacific Security Affairs in the Biden administration and author of a new article in Foreign Affairs magazine, The Case for the Pacific Defense Pact.
The entire region, including U.S. allies and partners, will be looking for a message of continuity from the United States, that Washington remains committed to the Indo-Pacific, remains committed to its alliances and partnerships, and the jury is still out on what exact message Secretary Hegseth will deliver on this.
Hegseth travelled to the Philippines and Japan earlier this year and reiterated a message of U.S. commitment to the region. On this trip, Dr. Ratner expects Secretary Hegseth to push partners to do more to counter China, and is himself calling for major security allies, Australia, Japan and the Philippines, to create a collective defence pact with the US.
The task ahead is for countries that believe in preserving peace and stability, for retaining the status quo, to come together. We have been doing that with allies and partners in a more informal capacity. And what I argue is now the time is come to formalize that in a way that will be much more effective at keeping the peace.
But President Donald Trump has inserted a new level of uncertainty into global affairs, unleashing an international trade war and offering sometimes conflicting assertions on conflicts like the war in Ukraine. As such, Hegseth will likely need to achieve a balancing act in Singapore of shoring up confidence in the US while also asserting pressure on partners to step up efforts against Beijing. Nick Harper, CNA, Washington.
And CNA, as always, will have a sizable team on the ground to cover the speeches and discussions over the weekend. Arnold Gay, Leong Wai Kit, Olivia Seong and Lok Wei Su will help us understand the backdrop and what to expect.
Singapore is no stranger to hosting important political meetings. The presidents of China and Taiwan in 2015, the Trump-Kim summit in 2018. But the Shangri-La dialogue is more than just a one-off. Singapore has been home to Asia's premier defense summit for more than 2 decades, a gathering of senior officials that usually includes top political leaders. And it all happens right there.
Right here at the Shangri-La, Singapore. For 3 days a year, this place becomes a geopolitical beehive with hundreds of people representing dozens of countries coming in and out of this building, all while it continues to operate as a hotel. Inside, though, it's far from your usual vacation spot with keynote speeches, themed sessions, and back-to-back bilateral meetings. Some of the action takes place here in the hotel lobby, but the highly secure heart of it all is down that way, around the ballroom.
Now picture this ballroom packed with delegates, diplomats, and defense chiefs. On Friday night, it's here where French President Emmanuel Macron will deliver the keynote address for this year, the first European leader to do so. Then on Saturday morning, we are expecting U.S. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth to take the stage. It will be his first time attending the event since taking office earlier this year. Now, you may remember him for sharing some pretty detailed military plans on Signal Chat, but he's also spoken about U.S. defense policy and deterring China in the Indo-Pacific. Past U.S. defense chiefs have talked about the American vision of security in the Asia-Pacific region, touching on tough issues such as the disputed South China Sea and the status of Taiwan, often criticizing China itself without actually naming it. We traditionally hear from a senior Chinese defense official on Sunday morning, delivering typically strongly worded remarks that decry hegemony, unilateralism, and alleged attempts to interfere in China's internal affairs. All this often viewed as a thinly veiled swipe at the U.S.
Also speaking over the weekend at the Shangri-La Dialogue, Malaysian Prime Minister Anwar Ibrahim, as well as security or defense officials from the EU, UK, France, Germany, Japan, the Philippines, Thailand, Vietnam, Cambodia, and elsewhere. Now, it's a lot of talk, but what does it really mean?
It's a chance to assess an increasingly complicated and interconnected world. Consider the backdrop. A recent dust-up between nuclear-armed neighbors India and Pakistan on the heels of a terrorist attack in the disputed region of Kashmir. A more than 3-year-long conflict between Russia and Ukraine, an invasion that turned into a war, which has pitted the West against Moscow and seen China balance neutrality with its no-limits partnership with Russia. The crisis morphing in the time of US President Donald Trump into a transactional arena marked by acrimony, mineral deals, and potential territorial trade-offs. And over in the Middle East, where Mr. Trump has just completed a deal-making tour. War in Gaza has kept the region on edge for nearly 2 years as Israel's military goes after the Palestinian group Hamas. It's a conflict that has seen battles break out in neighboring Lebanon, flare-ups between Israel and Iran, assaults on Israel by Iran-backed Houthi rebels in Yemen, who are also attacking Red Sea shipping lanes. And then overarching questions, too, about the very future of Gaza and its people. And here in Southeast Asia, a civil war grinds on in Myanmar, where the population, including various ethnic armed groups, is fighting the military. It's been a nagging issue for the ASEAN bloc, but has also roped in China due to border tensions and concerns about criminal activity.
If that's not complex enough, trade has become an even hotter geopolitical issue, with the Trump administration slapping tariffs on nations all around the world, hitting China the hardest. Exports and imports are not just economic issues, but a security matter as well, threatening to raise the cost of living for households just about everywhere.
All as the US, China, and other players race to stay ahead on tech, with restrictions imposed on chips needed for everything from electric vehicles to advanced AI. Now, decades of globalization have given way to a new era of strategic nationalism, where some days it's the US versus China, or the US versus Canada, or the EU.
norms and protocols shifting, the predictable becoming more and more unpredictable.
Okay, so plenty to take in. A tense and challenging setting for this Shangri-La dialogue. We should also mention there'll be discussions here about maritime security and sovereignty, cyber security, protecting the integrity of crucial undersea cables, and then the present and future status and control of space.
The Shangri-La dialogue provides an opportunity to talk about all of that and more. The speeches, the panels, the questions from the audience, the bilateral meetings, the surprise guests. It's a forum aimed at taking the temperature of the here and now.
Tying what happens in the world to Asia and highlighting the crucial role Asia plays in the world.
The global and regional powers, the spheres of influence and the rivalries, the impact of everything from trade and arms sales to tech and history.
It's all part of the agenda at the IISS Shangri-La Dialogue right here in Singapore. Stay with us on CNA as we unpack it all for you in the coming days.
Well, coming up next on East Asia Tonight, we'll have more on the trade war as we take a deeper dive into the impact of the President Donald Trump's levies on the region on CNA+. A U.S. trade court, as we mentioned earlier in the bulletin, has blocked most of U.S. President Donald Trump's wide-ranging tariffs from taking effect. Well, the ruling, however, can still be repealed by the administration. But damage has already been dealt to economies amid global uncertainty. While things appear to have calmed down somewhat after the leader earlier paused most of the tariffs, there have already been consequences beyond just imports and exports. Well, Insight's Nicholas DeRoos has been following the story very closely, and he is here in the studio to tell us more. So, Nicholas, in the course of your production, which has been very, very intense, what has the response been like in Asia to Trump's trade war?
So really, I was start off by saying that, the show is premiering tonight, and we have been editing right down to the wire because this story has been changing so rapidly. And I think that the two things that, have really characterized this administration really is uncertainty and unpredictability. And that has really hung over, Asia, not just governments, but businesses as well. And they're really sort of grappling with these two issues, because they can go to sleep one day with some information and they wake up the next day with new information and the entire thing changes. So I think a lot of countries and companies right now are sort of taking this kind of like wait and see approach, really, because as you mentioned, the administration can still appeal this decision, but that kind of sets up that long legal battle, and we don't know what's ahead. There are questions of, will this administration respect the court's decision if it comes out afterwards? So I think a lot of companies and countries are really just trying to hedge their bets and taking like a wait-and-see approach.
Yeah, I would say Trump has really been keeping all of us on our toes, keeping us busy. What's interesting to highlight as well is that this time the tariffs, right, second term under Trump, it's impacted not just, includes his close partners, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, people that have been perhaps exempted from the tariffs before. So I understand that you took a look at how the steel and aluminum industries in South Korea may have come under pressure. And what did you find out?
So, while most of the tariffs have paused, industry-specific tariffs, remain. And that has really impacted South Korea, which is the fourth largest exporter to the U.S. For steel. And really that has really put a damper on, companies and workers in South Korea, because not only are they dealing with the tariffs, they're also dealing with things like competition from China as well as a slowing economy. Let's take a listen to what they said.
알루미늄에도 25% 관세 지금 부과하겠다라고 해서 사실 저희 업계에서는 지금 사실 초비상입니다.
트럼프는 지난번에 대통령 선거 과정에서도 얘기했지만 미국 제조업을 부활시키겠다. 그래서 미국의 현지에서 제조업을 생산을 하게 하고 또 그 과정에서 러스트벨트를 중심으로 한 고용 문제를 해결하겠다고 하는 것이 기본적인 문제인 것 같은데 이런 관세 부과는 한국의 소위 말해서 가격 경쟁력을 떨어뜨리기 위해서 타시장으로 지금 돌리든지 아니면 현지 생산을 하든지 하는 그런 결과를 가져오게 될 것 같습니다.
Any tariffs on South Korean steel come at an already difficult time for the industry. Last November, steel giant POSCO shut a 45-year-old plant. It also laid off hundreds of workers. The country's steelmakers have struggled to compete with China on costs. In September 2024, South Korean steel was priced at $2,570 per ton, while Chinese steel costs an average of $863 per ton.
예전 같은 10년 같은 경우에는 중국산 제품이 저가에 싼 맛을 썼다 그랬어요. 그리고 품질이 퀄리티가 되게 떨어져요. 근데 지금은 달라요, 많이. 중국산 제품도 지금 퀄리티가 되게 올라가 있고, 제품도 좋아요. 그리고 가격이 싸고. 그러다 보니까 저희 같은 수요 입장에서는 아무래도 굳이 국산 걸로 해주세요, 아니면 중국산을 쓰죠. 중국산을 쓰죠.
중국이 10억 톤을 연간 생산을 하기 때문에 지금 중국에서 저가의 대량 물량 공세를 해버리면 세계 시장은 중국이 석권하게 되는 그런 상황이라는 것이 그 중장기적인 원인이라고 볼 수가 있겠습니다.
Okay, so Nick, U.S. and China, they recently wrapped up talks, right, to lower tariffs as well and continue these negotiations. But Trump did say that some tariffs will remain, and that is linked to the opioid crisis. So how do you think negotiations will impact cooperation when it comes to drugs?
Right. So Trump, blames China for the fentanyl crisis in the U.S. And, he says that drugs from China are going to Mexico and then going into the U.S., right? But the situation is a little bit more complex than that. And we spoke to a journalist who's been tracking the issue to find out more.
When I went there in 2018, there were totally legal, above-board companies that were selling these fentanyl products, these fentanyl analogs.
Analogs are slight chemical modifications of the original chemical. For example, this is the chemical formulation of fentanyl. But by removing a carbon and 2 hydrogen atoms, it becomes acetylfentanyl, an analog with similar effects to fentanyl. Analogs can be easily converted into fentanyl. They may escape detection, and some are not even classed as controlled substances.
So, fentanyl has been banned in China for a long time. But all the chemists had to do was just subtly tweak the molecule. All of a sudden they had a brand new chemical that was totally legal, but just as deadly as fentanyl. And so eventually the government would ban each of these analogs one by one by one. But then all the chemists had to do is tweak it a little more. There was kind of an international outcry about this. And finally in 2019, China banned these fentanyl analogs all at once. This was something the United States wanted them to do, and they finally did it. So in some ways, China has been complying with what the U.S. wants.
Okay, Nick, so very quickly before I let you go, tell us what other effects of this trade war did you explore this particular episode?
So we also, went to Taiwan and, we sort of explored the effects of the trade war on Taiwan's Silicon Shield. Now, Trump is threatening, tariffs on, TSMC, which is a vastly important company, to the semiconductor industry. And so the episode also unpacks, what is it going to mean if Trump carries through with those tariffs, and what is it going to mean for the larger semiconductor industry?
Oh, excellent. Looks like it's going to be a very interesting episode. Thank you so very much, Nicholas, for your insights on Insight. And of course, you can catch Nicholas's epic episode, Insight's Trump 100 Days Trader Woes in Asia, tonight, Thursday, 6th of February, at 9 p.m. Singapore, Hong Kong time on CNA. And on that note, it's time to wrap up Thursday's edition of East Asia Tonight. Don't forget your headlines anytime at cna.asia. Thanks for watching.